The first thing I noticed was the quiet. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that feels like it's watching you. The house had always been silent, yet that morning it felt heavier, as if the walls were holding their breath. I stood near the doorway longer than usual, keys in my hand, wondering why leaving felt like a decision instead of a routine. I had lived this way for years, available, agreeable, always present, the kind of person who answered before being asked, who adjusted before anyone noticed discomfort. I told myself it was kindness, but deep down I knew it was fear. Fear of being unnecessary, fear of being left behind if I stopped giving. The house seemed to understand that fear. Its corridors stretched longer than they should have, doors creaked even when untouched. Every sound felt like a reminder that something was unfinished. I moved carefully, as if the wrong step would awaken questions I wasn't ready to answer. In the living room, the mirror caught my attention. It always did. Hung at just the right height, reflecting not just my face, but my hesitation. I avoided looking at it directly, pretending to adjust a lamp, straighten a cushion, small tasks to delay the moment of recognition. I told myself I was tired, that this heaviness was normal, that everyone felt this way when they gave too much and slept too little. But the house didn't agree. Its silence pressed closer, asking without words, "How long will you keep disappearing for others?" I sat down, letting the weight settle. For the first time, I allowed the thought to form clearly. I was exhausted from being needed, not loved, not understood, just needed, and that realization frightened me more than loneliness ever had. The mirror reflected my stillness. I didn't look away this time. Something in my expression had changed, though I couldn't name it yet. The house remained quiet, patient, as if it knew this was only the beginning. That night, sleep came slowly. My thoughts moved louder than my body, replaying moments I had ignored for years. Times I said yes when my chest said no. Times I stayed silent to keep the peace. Times I confused sacrifice with connection. The house responded with small sounds, gentle but deliberate, like it was listening. I woke just before dawn, the room dim and still. For a moment, I forgot where I was. Then the familiar weight returned. The mirror stood across the room, catching the faint light of morning. I felt drawn to it, not out of curiosity but obligation, like it expected something from me. I stood and walked closer. My reflection looked ordinary, almost calm, yet my eyes held a question I had never answered. Who was I when no one needed me? The thought unsettled me. I had built my worth around usefulness, around being the one people leaned on. Without that, I felt undefined. The house creaked softly, not threatening, not warning, acknowledging. I realized then that the discomfort wasn't coming from the walls or the silence. It was coming from the space I had never allowed myself to occupy, the space where my needs existed without explanation. I didn't change anything that morning. I didn't make promises or declarations. I simply noticed how often I rushed, noticed how rarely I rested without guilt, noticed how the house seemed less heavy when I stood still. As sunlight filled the room, the mirror lost its intensity. It became just another object, waiting. The house grew quiet again, but this time it felt different. Not watchful, not demanding, curious. I took a breath, slow and deliberate. Something had begun, not loudly, not dramatically, but honestly. The house didn't whisper yet. It didn't need to. It was waiting for me to listen, to myself first. The next few days passed without incident, yet everything felt slightly off, as if the house had shifted its balance. Nothing moved, nothing broke, but the silence carried awareness. I noticed it most when I tried to fall back into old habits, answering messages immediately, offering help before it was requested, filling pauses with explanations no one asked for. Each time I did, the air felt heavier, the rooms felt tighter. It was subtle but unmistakable. The house responded to my choices, not with noise, but with weight. One afternoon, I sat alone at the dining table, hands resting flat against the wood. I realized how unfamiliar it felt to be still without purpose. No one needed anything. No task demanded my attention. The discomfort rose quickly, urging me to distract myself, to become useful again. Instead, I stayed. The house remained quiet, but the mirror in the hallway caught a sliver of light and reflected it toward me. I didn't look directly, but I felt its presence, not accusing, observing, as if it was waiting to see whether I would run from the discomfort or let it exist. I thought about how often I had mistaken being needed for being valued, how easily I had allowed others to define my place by how much I gave. The realization felt heavy, but also clarifying. I wasn't angry, I was aware. The house seemed to ease as that thought settled. The air felt lighter, the silence softened. It wasn't approval, it was alignment. For the first time, the space around me reflected something honest. I stood up slowly and walked through the rooms, not fixing, not adjusting, just passing through. Each step felt deliberate, each breath felt mine. The house didn't resist, it didn't whisper, it simply existed alongside me. That night, I slept without dreams. In the morning, I noticed how quickly guilt tried to return. It appeared in small thoughts. You should check on them. You should explain yourself. You should do more. The words came automatically, practiced over years of repetition. I didn't obey them. The house felt different when I resisted. Not tense, not cold, steady, as if it was holding space for me to learn something I had avoided my entire life, that my worth didn't require performance, that my presence didn't need justification. I passed the mirror and paused this time, not out of habit, but curiosity. My reflection didn't look demanding or disappointed. It looked patient, waiting for me to decide whether I would keep abandoning myself for comfort that wasn't mine. I took a breath and stepped away. The house remained still, but the silence felt earned. I realized then that silence wasn't punishment, it was room. Room to feel, to choose, to exist without explanation. I had never allowed myself that kind of space before. Throughout the day, I practiced small refusals. I delayed replies. I said no without adding reasons. Each time, my chest tightened briefly, then relaxed. The house responded with calm. No creaks, no pressure, just presence. By evening, something shifted. The quiet no longer felt heavy. It felt supportive, like a hand resting gently at my back. The mirror no longer pulled at my attention. It waited without expectation. I understood then that the house wasn't testing me, it was reflecting me. When I honored myself, it honored the space. When I stayed grounded, it stayed still. That night, as I turned off the lights, I felt something unfamiliar but welcome. Trust, not in the house, in myself. And for the first time, that felt like enough. Days passed, and the house continued to change, not in appearance, but in feeling. It felt lighter, quieter, less demanding. The silence no longer pressed against my thoughts. It allowed them to rise and fall on their own. There were no whispers, no sudden sounds, no sense of being watched. On the surface, everything seemed calm, but inside me, something stirred. When I rested, old fears surfaced. They arrived without warning, carrying familiar shapes: guilt, doubt, the urge to justify myself even when no one asked. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying moments from my past. Times I had stepped back, times I had chosen myself, times I wondered if I had been selfish instead of honest. The house didn't respond to these thoughts. It stayed quiet, almost distant, as if it refused to interfere. That unsettled me more than the whispers ever had. Without noise to blame, I was left alone with myself. At night, my dreams became vivid. I dreamed of doors I never closed, rooms I kept returning to even though nothing waited there anymore. In the dreams, voices called my name, not angry, not kind, just questioning, asking why I had changed, why I had stopped giving, why I no longer stayed. I woke from one of those dreams with my heart racing, the room dim and unfamiliar. That's when I noticed the mirror. It was glowing faintly. Not harsh, not threatening, just enough to be noticed. The light didn't spill across the room. It stayed contained, gentle, deliberate. For a moment, fear rose in my chest, but it passed quickly. This felt different. The glow didn't demand attention, it invited it. I sat up slowly, watching the reflection shift as I moved. The mirror felt patient, as if it had been waiting for this moment, not to accuse, not to reveal something hidden, but to acknowledge something I had avoided. The house remained silent, holding its breath, and for the first time, I didn't look away. I stood before the mirror, barefoot on the cool floor, the faint glow reflecting softly across my face. My reflection met my eyes without distortion, without judgment. It didn't feel separate from me. It felt close, familiar. The reflection spoke, but not with sound. "You are not cruel. You are complete." The words didn't echo. They didn't repeat. They settled quietly, like something remembered rather than learned. I felt my chest loosen, the tightness I had carried for years easing without effort. I realized how often I had confused boundaries with coldness, how easily I believed that choosing myself meant harming others. The mirror held none of that belief. It showed me someone steady, someone present, someone whole. The glow faded slowly, not all at once, as if it wanted to be sure I had heard what mattered. Soon, the mirror returned to ordinary glass. No light, no message, just my reflection, unchanged, but understood. The house remained quiet, but the silence felt warmer now, supportive, as if something had been resolved without needing explanation. I returned to bed and slept deeply. No dreams, no voices, no unfinished doors pulling me back. My body rested in a way it hadn't in years, unguarded and calm. When morning came, the light felt softer. The air felt lighter. The mirror didn't draw my attention. It had nothing left to say. As I moved through the house, I noticed how my steps felt more certain, how my thoughts no longer raced to justify themselves. The guilt that once knocked so loudly had grown faint, distant, easy to ignore. For the first time, rest didn't feel like avoidance. It felt deserved. I understood then that healing doesn't always arrive through effort. Sometimes it arrives when you stop arguing with who you are. The house stayed still, and I carried that stillness with me. And for the first time in years, I moved forward without carrying fear alongside me. I met people again, but differently, not with urgency, not with the quiet fear of being replaced or forgotten. I listened without losing myself. I offered help without disappearing into it. Each interaction felt lighter because I no longer carried the responsibility of being everything to everyone. Some people noticed the change immediately. They leaned in, curious, respectful. Conversations felt balanced, mutual. There was space for me to speak, to pause, to disagree without apology. With them, I felt present rather than drained. Others reacted differently. My pauses made them uncomfortable. My boundaries confused them. When I didn't rush to respond or explain myself, distance appeared. Not dramatically, not cruelly, just naturally. And for the first time, I didn't chase it away. I returned home after those meetings and noticed how the house responded. The silence remained calm, approving in its own quiet way. There were no creaks when I entered, no tension in the air. The space welcomed me without asking what I had given away. I realized how unfamiliar that feeling was, to return to a place that didn't demand proof of worth. The house didn't care who stayed in my life and who didn't. It only reflected whether I stayed with myself. I moved through the rooms slowly, noticing how grounded everything felt. The mirror no longer pulled at me. It reflected without commentary, just presence. That evening, I sat alone and thought about how often I had feared change. I had believed that altering my behavior would cost me connection. But what I was losing now wasn't connection, it was imbalance. The house remained still, holding that truth gently. It didn't celebrate, it didn't warn, it simply existed alongside me, steady and neutral. For the first time, I understood that peace doesn't require everyone to stay. It only requires honesty about who you are. The lesson revealed itself slowly, not as a realization, but as a pattern I could no longer ignore. The people who benefited most from my silence were the ones most unsettled by my voice. They didn't accuse me openly. They hesitated. They withdrew. They questioned the change without naming it. And I didn't rush to fix it. The house felt unchanged by these shifts. Its silence remained consistent, grounding, patient. It didn't react to who left or who stayed. That indifference taught me something important, that my life wasn't meant to be managed by other people's comfort. I noticed how my body responded when I spoke honestly. There was fear at first, a familiar tightening in my chest, but it passed quickly, replaced by relief. Each time I honored my truth, the fear lost its authority. I stood in front of the mirror one afternoon and noticed something new. I didn't search my reflection for approval or reassurance. I looked only long enough to recognize myself. That was enough. The house seemed to understand this shift. The silence felt complete now, not waiting, not watching. It had nothing to add. I realized that boundaries aren't walls, they're clarity. They show others where you end and where they begin. And clarity, I learned, feels threatening to those who rely on confusion to stay comfortable. The fear I once carried about being misunderstood no longer felt like my burden. I didn't need to correct every assumption. I didn't need to explain every choice. My life didn't require consensus. As night fell, the house grew darker, quieter, settled. I turned off the lights without hesitation, without second-guessing. The space held me without question. And in that quiet, one truth became undeniable. People who benefit from your silence will fear your voice. That fear was never mine to carry. One evening, I walked past the mirror without stopping. There was no pause, no second thought, no quiet pull asking me to turn back. My steps stayed steady, natural, unforced. The mirror remained where it was, silent and ordinary, reflecting nothing I needed to see. That was the moment I understood. I no longer needed confirmation. I no longer searched for permission, neither from reflections nor from people. The mirror had finally become what it always should have been, just glass. It held no power, no answers, no judgment, and realizing that felt like setting something heavy down after carrying it for years. The house felt different too. Warm, ordinary, grounded. Not empty, not heavy, just complete. The rooms didn't echo old emotions anymore. They didn't remind me of who I used to be or who I tried to become for others. They simply existed, calm and still. Freedom didn't arrive loudly. There was no dramatic shift, no overwhelming rush of relief. It came quietly, settling into me like something familiar returning home. It felt real because it didn't need to be explained. It didn't ask to be celebrated. I moved through the house slowly, nothing touching, nothing fixing. I noticed how calm my breathing was, how my thoughts no longer raced ahead looking for approval or reassurance. Everything felt aligned in a way I had never experienced before. For so long I had waited to be understood, waited to be chosen, waited for someone to recognize what I gave so freely. That waiting had shaped my life more than any decision I consciously made. Standing there, I realized the truth plainly. I was free because I no longer waited to be chosen. I had chosen myself.
The house no longer whispered. Not because it was empty, but because it had nothing left to teach me. The silence felt full now, settled, complete. It didn't press against my thoughts or demand interpretation. It simply existed, steady and calm, like a chapter that had reached its natural end. I walked through each room one last time, not searching, not remembering, not checking for unfinished feelings. The walls stood firm. The air felt light. There were no shadows stretching unnaturally, no corners holding unanswered questions. Everything felt resolved. I realized then that the house had never been the source of my fear or growth. It had only reflected what I carried inside. When I doubted myself, it echoed doubt. When I stayed silent, it grew loud. When I waited, it waited with me. And now that I was steady, it remained still. For years, waiting had defined me. Waiting for understanding. Waiting for appreciation. Waiting for someone else to decide when I was enough. That waiting taught me patience, but it also delayed my life. It kept me standing in place while time moved forward. Standing there now, I felt no urge to wait anymore. I didn't need signs. I didn't need reassurance. I didn't need closure from anyone or anything outside myself. I opened the front door, and the outside air met me gently. The world beyond the house looked exactly the same, but I wasn't. I stepped forward without hesitation, without looking back, without fear of leaving something unfinished behind me. Nothing followed. Nothing called me back. The lessons were learned. The echoes were gone. The house remained quiet because its purpose was complete. And I no longer waited, because I had finally arrived.